So how many of you have heard the words new thought, not new age, new thought before? Sir. All right, and back here. Wonderful. So it actually evolved in the U.S. on its own, and then a parallel movement developed in the British Isles that was known as higher thought. So we had the higher thought movement over here, and we had the new thought movement over there. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was key to the philosophy of the new thought movement, but there was an inventor in Maine who was dying of consumption back in the 1830s, 40s, and he discovered mesmerism. And someone told him, one of his regular subjects, told him, well, if you'll let me put my hands on the back, I can fix your kidneys that are suffering from the consumption medicine that you've been getting. And he said, whoa, we have to stop here. Because he began to realize that our beliefs and our symptoms were totally tied together. How many of you have heard of Louise Hay? All right. That's exactly what she's done, isn't it? She said, if you have this set of symptoms, you have this set of beliefs, and here's some words to help you chip away at those beliefs. Right? Well, chipping away is nice, but it doesn't do the job very quickly. Right? And so a lot of the New Thought movement is to help people get in touch with what those belief systems are and to begin to undo their power over their bodies and over their lives. So I got into it because I had been working very hard as a futurist, college professor, administrator, mother of two, working in 2 cities with a small consulting business in one of those cities and the university in another one. And the body just said, are you kidding me? They kind of gave out. And the doctors at that time had no idea what the symptoms were about. They could just say that all the hormones were totally out of whack, that the internal bleeding could not be stopped, and that I might last another 6 months. That was not going to happen. And I had heard that some people had found ways to not be sick anymore. And in particular, I'd heard of a woman named Catherine Marshall, who is the wife of a man named Peter Marshall, who is a man called Peter. You may have seen this film. He's a Scotsman, a Presbyterian minister, who became, of all things, the chaplain for the U.S. Congress. I know, who knows, right? And she discovered when she went to bed with TB, what they called TB at the time, which is what they had called consumption prior, that when she really took in the idea of forgiveness, her symptoms began to dissolve away. And so she began to do a practice of forgiveness, which is really similar to the Louise Hay practice in You Can Heal Your Life. Well, Louise Hay is perhaps the most recent well-known promulgator of New Thought movement in the U.S. and truly an exemplar of making it work. She herself has been diagnosed with cancer more than once and has reversed it more than once and has encouraged many other people in that world. So what Quimby found back in the 1840s and 50s was that if he could really zero in on what people's beliefs and symptoms were and how they were linked, he could help them shift those belief systems, and then the symptoms would go away. And one of his students, or one of his patients, was an itinerant dentist's wife, who was also a homeopathic physician, named Mary Baker Patterson. And she had childhood injuries that were causing her great distress, and he got her through them. Quimby got her through them. And so for a couple of years, she went around New England and included in her regular talks and operations of, not operations, but offerings of teachings and medical treatment, homeopathic treatment, she would lecture on the Quimby method of mental healing. Well, Quimby was one of those people who gave too much and cared for himself too little, and he managed to completely wear out his body, and he didn't stop like I did. And unfortunately, he did pass on very early in 1866, September of 66. And Mrs. Patterson had an accident that winter, and she went running back to Quimby, and he wasn't there. So now she was on her own. And she took her notes from Quimby, and she took the Bible, and she sat down in a rooming house, and over the next 3 weeks to a month, she was able to reverse the symptoms from this fall that had reignited the childhood injury and carried it further. Divorced Dr. Patterson, and she went back to Lynn, Massachusetts as Mrs. Glover. So we're looking at a woman named Mary Baker, who married George Glover. He died. She went back. She studied homeopathy. She married Dr. Patterson. She's Mary Baker Patterson. And then she divorces him. And in the 1870s. Right? And she can support herself just fine. Well, the Lynn newspaper was constantly writing articles about how Mrs. Glover had done some miraculous something. And the very first well-known one is that she was walking on the beach and she encountered a young man on a towel who his mother had left him briefly while she ran to get something that they had forgotten. And when the mother came back, this young man who had never walked was walking down the beach with Mrs. Glover. And that was in the Lynn, Massachusetts paper. There were other occasions where people were on their deathbed, and Mrs. Glover would come and spend an hour or 2 or 3 with them, and they would get up and fix breakfast or whatever, right? So Mrs. Glover found the key, right? And that's when she wrote a little book called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And in her thinking, she had managed to integrate the ideas that she had developed through her interaction with Quimby and his method, and the biblical support. Because there's a lot of support in both the New and Old Testament for the idea that if we change our beliefs, we change our lives. Right? It shall be as you believe, says Jesus. And then there's Elias and Elijah, both of whom raised people from the dead. It's there, but we've been taught not to see it. Well, Mrs. Glover, in 1876, decided to start teaching other people her method. And she held a class, and there were 3 graduates in June of 1877, and she had her little pamphlets that she had written, and one of those graduates was a man named Asa Eddy. And basically he said, if you will marry me, I will take you to Boston and we will create the Massachusetts Metaphysical College. And they did. So Mrs. Eddy, Mary Baker Eddy, began to institutionalize this method that she had developed and experienced over the previous 20 years almost, yes?
Sorry, this is same as Mrs.
This is Christian Science.
No, Mrs. Eddy was the same as Mrs.
Glover, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Eddy,
I missed that.
all one person, right?
Sorry about that.
Mary Baker Glover Patterson Eddy
Okay, got it.
is the founder of what is called Christian Science today. And what happened is, and many students followed on similar paths that we'll talk about in a minute, but they all founded schools. She founded a school, a college. But you can't go to a standard Catholic Mass or a standard, what we call in the States, hell and damnation preacher, right? When you're realizing that, what God is offering is all love, that infinite all that is a good and constant good and always present in that way. And so people after a while would say, I can't go to church anymore, but I want to go to church. Will you please create a church? And that's when the Church of Christ Scientist was originated, was when her students started coming back to her in Boston, Massachusetts. And by 1903, they'd raised enough money to build an amazing building. And if you ever get to Boston, do go to the mother church of the Christian Science Church. So along the way, she ran classes basically every 6 months, and they would have 6 to 12 students each time. And she would also continue to tour around New England. And she went on a tour, and she was in New Hampshire, and visited someone who had been one of her students. And this woman went out to her neighbors and said, I'm inviting everyone over for tea. She didn't say she had an important out-of-town guest. And so some of the neighbors showed up for tea, and Mrs. Eddy began to introduce Christian Science. Well, one of the people at that tea, that's particular one I'm describing, was the former high school teacher who lived next door to this woman, and she and her husband were George and Emma Hopkins. And Emma Hopkins was born Josephine Emma Curtis in the 1840s. We think 1849, but her sister insists it was 1853. So it's always fun that way. But she was there, and this was 1884. Now, she was a dedicated teacher. She had taught science and math and ancient literature and many languages. And she was very conversant in the ancient philosophers. And she listened to Mrs. Eddy and she said, no way. This is not happening. This is not real. Materialist science does not support this. It's not happening. So a few months later, it's fall, and if you think, even here in England, you think about what life was like during the 1880s in an urban environment. We have open fireplaces, open stoves, chimneys pouring out smoke, right? Factories pouring out smoke, and smog being constant, and cats and dogs and no vacuum cleaners. Right. So respiratory illnesses were everywhere, all through that period, and her family fell subject to a respiratory illness. All her husband and she and her son, and then her sister, who was their helper. And the next door neighbor came over after several days, and nothing in the medical world was working for her, and said, please let me help. And the next door neighbor proceeded to do what is called a treatment, a mind treatment, and it's usually words spoken, getting into a level of consciousness where one feels the union with the divine, feels that power present in the world, and then invokes that power present in the lives of those around you. This is basically what a treatment is, and the Hopkins family recovered within 20. At which point, Emma wrote a letter to Mrs. Eddy and said, I must learn from the teacher. She also said, and I have no money to pay you because of my husband's college debts in 1884. Isn't that amazing? So she said, I will pay you from any returns from my practice. And Mrs. Eddy agreed. So Emma went to Boston, started commuting between New Hampshire and Boston on a regular basis, took the class, which at that time was 6 weeks. And it was all day, every day for 6 weeks. It was 12 lessons based on science and health with key to the scriptures. And she shone because that's how she is. She was a very wonderful student and a good teacher, and Mrs. Eddy invited her to edit the journal that was sent out to all the students and practitioners of Christian Science in the 1880s. So Emma becomes the journal editor, and she spends several days a week in Boston as the journal editor, staying in the dormitory of the Metaphysical College, and then going home to be with her family in between times. Well, that went on beautifully for a little over a year, and then suddenly she was told one October morning, no, you're not welcome here. You have to leave. No explanation. Some of us have done some research, and it turns out that the September issue of that journal was a place where Emma's editorial said words to the effect of the great mystical writers, Mrs. Eddy shines the brightest. One would think this is lovely.
Yeah,
isn't that marvelous? Well, there couldn't possibly be any other mystical writers besides Mrs. Eddy. And so she was kicked out.
Wow.
Yes. Now, I can understand this from the perspective of Mrs. Eddy had a program that worked, and she didn't like anyone messing with it, and calling it Christian Science. If it was Christian Science, it was her method, because it worked, right? And so that, I think, is what really was going on at that time. And Mrs. Eddy was clamping down on a lot of people who were former students at that time. She proceeded over the next 10, 20 years to say very nasty things about Emma Hopkins, but nonetheless she was able to continue the work.
So she didn't practice what she preached.
She practiced it in many ways. She did in many ways. I mean, we have stories of her riding in an open carriage down the street and people actually becoming healed simply by watching her, because she was radiating that healing presence. So we know that, I know, exactly.
But
it's this weird contradiction.
Well.
Yeah, it's a contradiction. But if you see it as, this works, do it my way, we know it works, then it's a little easier to take, yes? So Mrs. Hopkins then, because she'd been editing the journal, was well known in all the people that were studying Christian Science. And so a man in Chicago, Jack Swartz, called her, wrote to her, and said, please come, I'm going overseas for a few months, please come edit my journal. So it's called the Mind Cure Journal out of Chicago. And she and her family packed up and they headed off to Chicago. And there were a couple of other students who went along with her, and all together they created what they called the Emma Hopkins Institute. And very quickly, by February of '86, there are ads in the paper for Emma Hopkins offering trainings and offering healing, and even offering people to stay in her home for the 3 months they would need to completely absorb these 12 lessons and be able to go home. And the main difference at that point between Hopkins and Eddy was Hopkins said, make it your own and go teach it. Go teach your version of this. Because if it's coming through you, if it's your heart, your spirit, then it will be powerful. Right? But if it's just rote intellectual stuff, it will not be powerful. So one of her students was a woman named Mrs. Bingham, who was from Pueblo, Colorado, and Mrs. Bingham goes back to Pueblo, Colorado, and starts teaching people, and 3 of her students end up becoming the founders of something called Divine Science. And very soon thereafter, she was in her first graduating class, one of her students was a man named E.B. Weeks, and he went down into Kansas and Missouri and started teaching down there at Kansas City. And it happened that a couple where she was dying, had been dying for a long time, and the doctors are saying, we're done, there's nothing we can do. And they come into the first lecture of the first class, and she wakes up and she realizes, she hears, I am a child of God, therefore I cannot inherit illness. And that's the key for her. And over the next several months, she immerses herself in all the healing passages in the Old and New Testament and fills her mind with these ideas. And they end up, Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, founding the Unity movement, which has expanded hugely, is published the Daily Word for 100 years now almost, and no, over 100 years now. And so they've continued. Emma continued to teach in seminary and offer many publications over the years. And I've been part of a group called Wise Women Press that's been tracking down everything she ever wrote. Mm-hmm. And we're publishing as much of it as we can, because there are great insights in what she offers, because she draws on this huge range of understanding. She had read the Zendavesta, she had read the Tao, she had read the Buddhist sutras that were available, and she could read it in the German as well as in the English. And a lot of that stuff hadn't been translated from German into English yet. And she could read Greek and Latin, and she was going back to Plotinus and Iamblichus and those guys. And she had read many of the modern transcendentalists, including Emerson, who predated her just a little bit. And Thomas Carlyle was one of her favorites. So she was drawing heavily on European as well as American resources to help justify, explain, intellectualize, make it so then the left frontal corpus comes in and says, no, that can't be so. There is reasoning, and that was huge for her. Reason this out. Take these principles and reason it out. And so she would bring in all these resources to help people. Ended up teaching 11,000 people, all of whom were coming to her with symptoms, all of whom left without. 11,000 cases. Well, Quimby, before her, it turns out we have 12,000 documented cases. In the 10 years he practiced, 12,000 cases of getting in touch with people's belief system, helping change that, and eliminating the symptoms as a result. Wow, right? So this is the foundation of what has been called the New Thought movement in the U.S. At the same time this is happening in the U.S., we've got something going on here in the U.K. And I was hoping to get a third book here that I call As We Think, So We Are, because it's a compilation of James Allen's works. What I have been doing since, for about 20 years now, is taking some of the somewhat difficult to read 19th century Victorian prose and turning it into modern English with bullets, and I provide exercises and so on. And I did that for the Emma material, Emma Curtis Hopkins material. I did it for some of her students as well. And when The Secret was published, they asked me to do it for the books that the Secret was based on, The Science of Getting Rich and The Master Key System. And then they said, who else? Who else? And I said, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I was really hesitant, because who would dare deal with Emerson's prose? Right? How dare I? And I actually had a few people come up to me saying, how dare you do this? But what has happened is we always put the original text in the back of these books, and people read through my version, and then they understand his version. Funny thing about that.
Yeah.
Right? So Emerson's work was really important here. And then I did it with a few other scholars, including James Allen. And James Allen was a marvelous guy. I just love this man. You know, back in the 1860s and 70s, he was a child working in a factory. And he taught himself to read. He would take copies of Shakespeare and Emerson off the shelf of his boss at the factory and take them home and read them. And at some point the boss figured out what was going on and hired him as his secretary. So the owner of the factory hired this young boy as a secretary, brought him to London. And as the business was successful for quite a while, but when the owner decided he wasn't going to continue with the business, this young boy, James Allen, was hired to edit a holistic health magazine here in London in the 1880s. Who knew? And the 1890s. And again, he became known all over the world. And what he began to realize was that it was possible to integrate Buddhism with Christianity. And he began to want to do that more specifically. So he resigned from the magazine and went off to Cornwall, got a little house that became sort of an international center. People would come and spend the night, and they would, the evenings would be filled with these wonderful conversations, right? And then he would go off very early in the morning up in the hill to meditate, and then he'd come down and he would write for a while, and then he'd garden for a while, and then dinner, and these great conversations. And in that process he wrote, As a Man Thinketh, which I took and wrote As We Think, So We Are. But he also wrote 6 or 8 other books that were making these more available, these principles that were woven into both the Christian teachings and the Buddhist teachings available to people. So James Allen is a remarkable person, and if you can follow up on his work, that would be marvelous. And I've already told them, and they know that they have to bring some of his. Unfortunately, Simon & Schuster, one of the biggest publishing companies in the world, said they couldn't get copies of it here. Isn't that weird? They couldn't arrange for you to have copies, and I'm sorry about that. But if you can get hold of his work, please do. Before James Allen's work became public and popular, people began to understand what he was doing. A man returned from India. He was born in Ceylon, and he came back to England, and he studied it, went through school, because all the British boys had to come back here, go through school during that time. And this would have been 1850, again, we're all in the middle of the 1800s there. And he came back to this country. He studied the law. He didn't want to be a lawyer. He wanted to be a painter. Emerson did not want to be a minister. He wanted to be a poet, right? Oh, well. So Troward, his name is Thomas Troward or Troward. Most of my British friends call him Troward, as in Howard. And he, was sent, he passed the civil service exam, was sent back to India, but this time to the Punjab. Now the Punjab is the melting pot of the Indian subcontinent. He had Jains, he had Hindus, he had Buddhists, he had Jews from the Roman diaspora living in that area. He had also Muslims in that area and Sufis. So he was magistrate for all these different cultures and languages. So he started expanding his own cultures and languages. And in the process discovered the truths that were in these other religious traditions and began to integrate things. And so he took a bunch of notes while he was there, and he had some interesting paranormal experiences. You interested in hearing any of the stories? The very first night he and his wife arrived at his new appointment as an assistant to the magistrate there, they were given the home of someone in the British community, right? And they settle in for the night, and he's dozing off, and his wife is reading, and suddenly his wife is screaming. And he wakes up. What is it? What is it? She said, "Didn't you hear the shot?" No. He didn't hear anything. And then she started telling him that she was sitting there, and all of a sudden a man walked into the room, said, "Don't worry, everything will be fine," and shot himself right there, and then disappeared. And he's going, "Really?" But she was so upset that they called the servants and they moved out of that room to a different room, made it through the night. And the next day, the owner of this home that they were staying in came to make sure everything was okay. And they said, "Oh yes, absolutely, except this horrible thing happened last night." The woman who owned the home went absolutely white, said, "Those were my husband's final words. That was my husband you were experiencing." Woke Thomas up. There's something more going on here. So when he would hear from various people about their experiences, some of which were paranormal, he didn't just automatically throw it out as a magistrate or an assistant magistrate. And he began to have other kinds of experiences like that. So basically it opened him to a larger understanding of who and what we are. Not just a mind and a body, or a brain that is cogitating, but something more. And so in 1906 he returned back to this country right here. He came to London, and he was working on his notes. He was compiling his notes. He thought he had something to say. And he was sitting in a tea room, and a woman sat down across, because sometimes you know how that is when you're sitting by yourself in a tea room. Someone says, "Do you mind if I sit there?" Right? And he's by a window, and he's writing in a very large scrawling script his notes on a yellow tab. And she happens to look down, and she says, "Excuse me, but it seems to me you are writing higher thought." And he says, "Well, I hope it is." And so she explained she's the newly elected secretary of the local association for higher thought. And she invites him to the meetings, and very soon after they inviting him to lecture, he was such a dry lecturer that everyone would wait for the notes so they could figure out what it was he was saying. But he was amazing because he had figured out how the sciences of the day, the electricity, and in 1906 we have general relativity too, and the vibrations, the understanding of cymatics that were beginning to emerge, he could see how they were supporting the idea that we are far more than just this body, and that we affect each other through these vibrations and through electrical fields in ways that were not clear to most people. So what I did is I took 5 or 6 of his essays that were not published in his early works, but his wife published posthumously, as well as 2 or 3 that were in his early work, and explained what he was saying in modern terms, and came up with some exercises and some questions to ponder, and so on. So in the back half of the book is there's always this black page in all of this Library of Hidden Knowledge series. There's a black page behind which is the original text. And everything in front is my own stuff with exercises and things to ponder and so on. So I also usually, in my books, particularly in that one, which is a history of the movement that I was just describing, will put in why and how our modern science explains how this works. Because I think we all need to be able to rationally reason it out and shut down that intellectual questioner that says, no way, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, in his chapter, his essay on healing, which was one of the posthumous papers, The Hidden Power and Other Papers in Mental Science, he says the subject of healing has been elaborately treated by many writers and fully deserves all the attention that's been given to it, but our goal here is to ground the reader in those general principles that underlie the conscious use of the creative power of thought. Troward rarely used the word God. What we would call God, he called the creative process. And he actually wrote a book called The Creative Process in the Individual. And it was, we are constantly being that creative process which generated the universe, is generating this body now, and is generating our world all the time. So he says, now the principle stated by all mental healers is that the appearance of illness is based in a belief, and the basis of all healing is a change in belief, which is the essence of new thought. As long as I've been thinking in my old thought, I will have my old experience. I have a new thought to have a new experience. It's not that this is a new way of thinking. We can trace it all the way back to the Zendavesta, right? And probably the Upanishads, if I really worked at it. And still, the concept is a new thought to each of us. And we have to dissolve the old thoughts and replace them with a new one. So he says, to recap what we've said thus far, the sequence from which this understanding results is as follows. The objective aware mind impresses its thought upon the subjective subconscious mind. Okay? And this has to do with the terms used in hypnosis and mesmerism, that the voice of the person hypnotizing reaches to the subjective subconscious mind and speaks and changes whatever the subconscious mind is thinking. And what he is suggesting is that we are all doing that all the time. That what we are telling ourselves with our conscious mind is what our body mind, the subconscious mind, is hearing and working from. And that absolutely fits my research and all the new neurophysiology. The second point, he says, the subconscious or subjective mind is the creative faculty within us and creates in the body and environment whatever thought is impressed upon it. Okay? So if I'm thinking a certain way, if I'm reading the newspaper, oh dear, if I am watching television, if I'm watching certain kinds of movies, I'm literally impressing on the body mind that the world is like that, and that it has to be responsive to that. Whereas if I'm filling my mind, as Myrtle Fillmore did, with the healing passages of the Bible or other literature out there, and you have a lot of it in here, then I am giving the subconscious mind, the subjective mind, the mind-body, a whole new set of instructions. And so I experience a whole new life. The third principle, he says, is the thought is the expression of the belief. I may not know what I believe. Most of us really don't know what we believe. We know what we say we believe. We know what we've been taught to believe. And so what I've learned over the years is if I want to know what I believe, I have to look at my experience. Because my belief around money is demonstrated all the time. My belief around friends is demonstrated all the time. My belief around my body is demonstrated all the time. If I want to change any of that, it's time for a new thought. But it's not a new surface thought. It's a new belief structure, if you will, right? And then this means that whatever the subjective mind creates is the external representation of our beliefs. So whatever we are experiencing is what we believe. Wayne Dyer said, you'll see it when you believe it, right? And he's one of the more recent people who followed this work. Well, Thomas was writing from about 1906 to about 1922 or 3, and then he passed on. He was pretty advanced at that point. And then his works were beginning to get published. And in 1917, a young man in Los Angeles who'd followed his brother, who was a congregational minister, out to Venice, California, was invited to attend because they were being pretty out there on the leading edge of thinking, invited to attend the Metaphysical Club of Los Angeles. And in the Metaphysical Club was a bunch of books, and what was on the table where Ernest Holmes was standing was a small book that was the Edinburgh Lectures by Thomas Troward. And Holmes looked at this book, and suddenly everything made sense. He had an intellectual framework that allowed him to move forward. He had been studying elocution in Boston when he was 15, 16 years old. He never got a degree except in elocution, which is interesting. And he had been trained, among other things, in Christian Science churches. So he was very aware that Christian Science healing was happening and that there wasn't much else out there. There were unity groups, but not in the Boston area. The Charles and Myrtle Fillmore groups were out there, but not so much in the Boston area. And so he was feeling like he needed support. And he found this book. It gave him a framework. And he and his brother set up a nursing home in Long Beach. And I've actually been by this building, not knowing that's what it was, that was using these techniques, this understanding that your symptoms will go away when we change the beliefs out of which they are emerging. And they were turning people's lives around. And so then they went back to the East Coast and started teaching other people these methods. And in 1924, he met with Emma Curtis Hopkins, whom he'd wanted to be speaking with for years. He interviewed everybody in sight, and she kept refusing, starting in 1918, the first time he asked. In 1924, she finally agreed. He came in for the interview. She proceeded to give him the first of her 12 lessons, and he realized, oh my goodness, I'm going to be coming back a few times. So he came back for all 12 lessons, at the end of which he telegraphed his brother and said, Sir, brother Fenwick, I really, really need to use the title of one of your books. Do you mind? And Fenwick said, of course not. And so Ernest Holmes wrote the book, The Science of Mind, in 1925, the year that Emma Curtis Hopkins passed away. And also in 1925, and you have copies upstairs, Florence Scovel Shinn wrote her book from her experiences through the Unity Center in New York City. She was a Greenwich Village artist who had learned, after her husband divorced her, that she could completely transform her life and other people's lives by changing the thought framework and belief system. And so this book is a marvelous set of exercises and anecdotal evidence. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. And that has been the core of my work for almost 30 years now. I've been writing these books for about 20 years. And then along about 2012, people started asking me about the future. Funny thing about that, there was a lot of wondering in 2012 about what was happening to the world. And so I started going back into my futurist work, and a lot of what I've been doing lately is integrating this work, which is about our belief system and what we are creating in the world, right? And the trends and the norms and the drivers for what is happening in human consciousness. And what I have seen is what many of you have read if you're doing anything transpersonal out there, is that humanity has completed a cycle of being and is about to move into a whole new cycle. That this one's been about 6,000 years. It was focused on materialism. The values of this period has been acquire, accumulate, and control. We are coming to the end of that. In fact, we're watching it crumble around us as a whole new value system emerges based on these spiritual understandings and based on the indigenous connection with the planet. And that's my other arm of my work. So I'm blending them as often as possible. So that's me, and that's some of what I think is important. And now it's your turn. And I'm going to grab a bite, a swallow. Thank you, dear. Thank you. That's very kind. So, questions, concerns, wishes, desires, thoughts that you would like to get rid of.
Did Emma Curtis Hopkins ever meet Florence Scovel Shinn?
Yes. There were, during the period between 1906 and 1923, Emma Curtis Hopkins spent every winter in New York City. And she taught, and she worked with a number of the leading edge people in the society at that time. Mabel Dodge actually wrote a book about her life. A biography of Mabel Dodge Lujan includes letters between the society, whatever you call those people, celebrity, Mabel Dodge, and Emma, and they were saying things like, that she really needed to meet with Bobby Jones again, or Isaac Stern really needed attention with her. So she was doing a lot of one-on-ones with people in the high society world of New York City between 1906 and 1923, and was a regular speaker at the Unity Center there, which Florence Scovel Shinn and Emily Cady were part of.
Interesting what you said about the woman who was riding down the street with a lot of charisma, yet she still had a human imperfection. And I think I had a terrible experience when I was a kid coming across a group of people that were actually psychic, no doubt about it, but were a little bit of sort of like, sexual perverts as well. I was 18.
Oh, hon.
And, one thing I did learn is people can have powers, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily, raise them, exalt them. And, so often it's easy to fall for these people put too much stake in the human being itself rather than the teachings, because the human is imperfect.
And that has been the nature of our culture for 6,000 years. I don't think it's the nature of humanity. Our culture has trained people, and this is what I call the default network. I started a radio show I called Noetic Moments, and you can go online and connect with it, because it's a history of the consciousness research and the neurophysiology. So our default network tends to fear and separation and control. And if we fall back into that, I'll be right there, sir. If we fall back into that, then all those behaviors come out, but they're all culturally trained. So if we had a different culture, we would not be doing those things. And that's the goal that I'm aiming for. And when I say culture, I'm talking about any place where light-skinned people are telling dark-skinned people what to do. And that's most of the world now. Sir?
I mean, I do like hands-on healing on myself for pain issues. Have you got any advice on using the new thought issues to help me? Can you give us any practical advice?
Absolutely. So when I was in that healing process and had not learned as much as I know now, I was using hands-on healing as part of my healing process as well, for me and for everyone else. The more I do for others, right, the more I'm doing through me, it touches me, and it contributes to me. And that's part of what Jesus meant when he says, giving is receiving. Right? So do as much as you can for anyone your hands tingle for, all right? But beyond that, be aware that you are not changing the body. You are revealing the truth of yourself. All right? Because the truth of yourself is you are perfect and whole and complete. You are in the, quote, image of the divine, unquote. But we have been trained to have these limited bodies with these issues, right? So as all of these teachers, especially Emma Curtis Hopkins, but Thomas to a large extent also, would say you need to realize you're not fixing anything. You're just revealing the truth. I hope that helps. Yes. Did I see? Okay. Yes, sir.
when you talk about belief, I mean, sometimes I've also seen these philosophers which say, if you act as if something is the case, then you can make that the reality as well.
Right. I call that chipping away at the belief system. Right? Because when I'm acting as if I'm saying, no, not that, this, right? Not what I have believed, but this. But if I can begin to take that belief and actually go, I'm dissolving this. This is no longer part of who I am. This is actually lesson 2 in the Emma teachings and in lesson 8. So in the both in the Baker Eddy teachings and the Emma Curtis Hopkins teachings, there's 12 lessons. The first 6 are about us, and the second 6 are about what we can do in the world, right? And they parallel each other. So lesson 1 is, it's all God, it's all good, it's all omnipotent presence, and I can say that any quality I call good is fully present here and now. Okay? That's lesson 1. But lesson 2 is all the other things that come up the minute I say that. Yeah. And letting go of, releasing those, negating those, dissolving those other thoughts. Now, there's lots of methods for doing that, and basically you need to have them no longer be part of your visual and kinesthetic and verbal sense of self. Oh, I'm free of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah? Then I can move forward. And to some extent, that's what forgiveness is. It's saying, I'm free of whatever it was that I was holding on to. Right? And so are you. We are both free of that. And I used the Course in Miracles at that time because there, frankly, wasn't a whole lot else available. But the Course in Miracles would say, you know you've forgiven someone when you think of them, all you experience is the love and the light between you. And not
hard work sometimes.
it takes time sometimes to get to that place. What I found was I could do the work of releasing. I would feel all the feelings, and then I'd figure out a way to separate myself from them, and then I'd sit in that wonderful light with them, and I'd feel that connection of pure love, pure light. And that would go along fine for a few weeks or months, and then it would be up again, right? So I had to do the process over again. But what I learned was each time I'm letting go of about 80%, and about 80%, and about 80%. And after 4 or 5 times through the process, it's just a little tweak, and then I no longer have those experiences anymore, either in my body or in my world. So that's how I have used that, rather than simply faking it till I make it. I hope that addressed your question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
So the first time you came across New Thought, was it introduced to you by somebody else? Did you come across it on your own?
Oh boy, we're getting into the paranormal. So I was aware of this other work around forgiveness, and I was aware of the Course in Miracles. And I was too weak to do almost anything for a while. And I was in great pain and often in a lot of tears and unhappiness. And there was a particular day I remember when I was curled up in a corner going, help me, help me, help me. And I got to the point where I couldn't even do that. And then I heard, help me, help me. And that was, what? There's something inside me that needs, yeah. And what I got was, it was part of me that was asking me to help my own healing, right? I began to call it the voice. And it would guide me. Yeah, and for a while I actually practiced letting it tell me everything. Am I eating now? What am I wearing now? Where am I going? Am I turning right? Am I turning left? All of that. For the better part of 2 years, I practiced that. And so it would take me to these places, right? And sometimes they were a unity church or a religious science church, or they were to a spot in a bookstore or to a library, and this pamphlet or this text would show up. Never a person, right? Except once. It was a couple that I knew invited me to learn Reiki. They arranged for me to learn the hands-on healing method called Reiki. And that was very helpful at that time too. So, but it was always being guided to something. And one of the most important things that I was guided to was by another Brit, a guy named Emmett Fox. Emmett Fox was actually he was Irish, but he went to school here in London and was an engineer who studied with Thomas Troward. And after Troward passed on, he was lecturing, sharing Troward's teachings, and he got on a boat, went to New York, and within 10 years was running the largest metaphysical church in the States. And they were filling Madison Square Garden on Wednesday night and had no church. They had an office on Fifth Avenue. And he would take July and August off and come back to Europe. But Emmett Fox wrote a little pamphlet. It was called The Golden Key. He's also written a number of books, The Sermon on the Mount, and a number of other wonderful interpretations of the New Testament. He was one of the founders of the 12-step program known as Alcoholics Anonymous. And so his work, The Golden Key, said basically, when there is an issue in your life, don't look at the issue. Look only at the divine. Look only at the power and the life and the light and the health. And he had a list of qualities of the divine. He said, never look at the problem. Because as you shift your focus to this other aspect of being, this begins to dissolve and this begins to become real. Mm-hmm. So that was a very important part, and as well as the other little ones that came my way. I continued to try to be a college professor and consultant for a number of years, and woke up one day and got very clear. The voice was very clear. I was done. And I was told I had to go in the ministry. I'm going, you're kidding me, right? I'm a woman. I don't buy into anything that's normally Christian anymore. I can't say that sin is normal, any of that stuff. There's salvation is whatever. And there were only Catholic and evangelical seminaries within any distance of where I was living. And then one day I had a dream. And the dream included this beautiful tall woman in a white cream-colored dress with large purple and blue flowers on it, redhead. And she's walking up to me and she says, "Welcome to the body of Christ." And I go, "What?" Because for me that meant evangelical Christianity, and I knew that wasn't where I belonged, right? And then guidance, my voice, said, "Today you're going to dress up," the next morning, "Today you're going to dress and go to this one place." And I said, this was in 92, and for 8 years I'd known about this place, and every time I checked in with guidance, it always said, "Don't go there, don't go there, don't go there." And this morning it said, "Go there." And I said, "You got to be kidding." Right? And I went, and I arrived late, and I snuck in around the corner. I was kind of behind the speakers, and it turned out that the usual minister wasn't there that day. But a tall, slender woman with red hair and a cream-colored dress with blue and purple flowers was. Wow. And she was the head of their ministry training program. And so I got into New Thought Ministry. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
This is how life is designed to work, folks. Anything other than that is a blockage created by our belief system. Yes, sir.
Can we live entirely without beliefs? So
no.
Not at all.
Sorry. No, what we can do is live without the culturally trained belief system.
Yeah.
And begin to dissolve that to the point. And I noticed you have Dispenza's book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. It's one of the tools you can use to dissolve the old belief system. Yourself is defined by the culture you grew up in. Remember, I started out in anthropology, right? And so I know acculturation and enculturation, and I understand how that happens. And so if I can look at what the culture trained me to believe, and I can say, ooh, this one isn't working, right? And then I can go back to the times where I was taught that, where it was reinforced, and begin to dissolve the energy around that. Then I can begin to step into a belief system that does work. And this, I believe now, is, I'm of the opinion that it's an integration of the indigenous value system with this notion that it's all one. There is only one. All beingness is one, manifest in many different forms, totally united at the core, and incredibly powerful at all levels of being. So that's kind of where I'm working toward. And what I'm looking forward to seeing humanity experience more fully. Thank you, sir. Thank you all. Have I used up my time, or do we have more time to play? I have not been tracking time at all.
Yeah, it's 6.
It is 6. Sometimes that guidance works. I'm fine staying, but that's up to you. It's your space.
So, sorry, so you're,
I'm staying.
So we can change our own thoughts.
Absolutely.
And there is methodology to do that.
Absolutely.
So, you can point to the books that we need for that.
Right.
So, but how do we change someone else's thoughts? Like even our children, for example, right?
Okay.
It's so hard.
Right. Okay, so this is a really important question, because we think we have to fix what's out there. What's out there is me experiencing my beliefs. When I change what's in here, that changes. I'll give you an example. During that period I was healing my body, part of what I was dealing with was my relationship with my husband. Mm-hmm. And at that point I had been the primary provider for 10 years. And the money issue was an issue, right? Yeah. And I wasn't able to provide right then. I was too sick. I couldn't do the work. He got a full-time job, and he started putting money in my account as I was doing this work. I never said a word to him. Never said a word to him. All right? His first full-time job in 10 years. The first time he was contributing to my life in 10 years.
Well, you did something.
I did the inner work, didn't say a word, continued to do my life as I had always done my life.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
People change when we change.
It's just for behaviors, but like problems, for example, habits, people are addicted, for example.
Okay, an addiction, if I am seeing an addiction, I have an addiction.
No.
Oh yes. It might be to alcohol, probably not. It might be to caffeine, probably not. It might be to work. It might be to a particular way of thinking. Did any of you see a movie called What the Bleep Do We Know?
Yeah.
If you can possibly see this movie, I strongly recommend it. I hope you have the DVD here. If not, one of my publishers, Beyond Words, produced this DVD, and we'll get you some. What the Bleep Do We Know is people from the sciences coming in and talking about why we have the experiences we have and how we can turn that around. And there's this marvelous thing on the addictions that we have. We have addictions to certain feelings. Like if my story about myself is I'm a victim, then I will do things without even intentionally doing them. My subconscious mind will create this experience of being a victim, right? Yeah. And so that's an addiction that we don't count as an addiction in our culture, right? So that What the Bleep Do We Know is a marvelous tool for getting in touch with some of these things. When I did the James Allen book, As We Think So We Are, I brought his exercises out to the fore. And he did an exercise that was very similar to the one that Benjamin Franklin did. When Ben Franklin was in the UK the first time, when he was in his 20s, he sowed a lot of wild oats. You probably have a bunch of Franklin kids out here. And he drank a lot. And he did a lot of things. And as he was getting on the boat to go back to the States, he went, I better clean up my act. And so he wrote down all the qualities he wanted to experience and be. This is in the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And he wrote a calendar, 1 through 31 across the top. And he would work on one quality at a time. And, if he was living that day, great, he'd mark it off. And if he missed a day, he'd start over. All right? And he had these 20 qualities of what a good man could be. And that's what he worked on going across and in his first couple of years back in the States, building that printing business that he is famous for. So James Allen came up with a similar kind of a method, which I included in the book As We Think So We Are. But all of my books and a lot of other books have specific methods you can use. whether it's the Emma Curtis Hopkins material in her lessons, or whether it's some of the things that are on the shelf, the Joe Dispenza work, etc. As we shift our belief systems, we are literally shifting not only what we perceive, because what we're perceiving is through the mask of our belief system, right? So as I clean up this one, I'm perceiving things differently, right? But it turns out we are projecting as well as perceiving. So what is happening out there is literally coming from our belief system. So the more we can shift that, the more fully our life can be the heavenly life that is based on a belief system that is in alignment with our spiritual being rather than our material, culturally trained being.
Sure, perfect.
I heard the but. Did y'all hear the but?
But
Yeah,
but if somebody really has a problem,
no. There's
it's
no
physical problem somebody has.
Physical is appearance. That is the essence of this teaching. If it is physical, if it is something you sense with your 5 senses, you are both perceiving through your belief system and projecting through your belief system. I've known addicts, I understand, and it's terrifying, especially when they're in your family, especially when they're people you care about. Absolutely. So I had a child who was becoming an addict. And I realized the more I worried about it, the more I was reinforcing it for her. Oh dear. I was reinforcing her addiction. I better step back from that. I used the golden key. And I began to see, and Emma teaches this too, I began to see that she was actually moving on a path. And she did not have to go that path. She could move on the path of her fulfillment. And what happened was, she got out of the position which was leading her into the addiction pattern. She continued the interest in those things, but started doing it from a research perspective rather than from a behavior perspective. Isn't that fun? I didn't do or say anything except shifted how I thought about her life. And I've seen this with my kids all along. When I start getting worried about them, I start hearing these calls, and they reinforce each other. I worry, they call, they're having difficulties, I worry, right? And then I wake up and I went, wait a minute. I know better. I know that at their core, everyone that I care about is healthy and happy and on the path of their fulfillment. And I may not see that path as my fulfillment, hopefully not, but I know it's their fulfillment. And when I know that for them, the calls are totally different. I get these, Mom, you'll never get this. You wouldn't believe this is happening. Such and such happened and such happened. Or they'll just say, oh, life is so good, But there's a shift in what they are telling me as there is a shift in me. For everyone in my family, you can believe this. It's okay. Because the appearance is not the reality. The appearance is what has emerged out of the culturally trained beliefs and the media reinforced beliefs of fear and distress. And I think I have to quit. Thank you so much for being here, and may you all live a life of new.